There have been a lot of efforts in the past and currently that are going on to document the history of Anderson County. And when we're starting this kind of discussion, I always like to point to two particular books. Almost any question that you start with when it comes to Black history is Gwendolyn Anderson's Profiles of Black Folks in Anderson County. Miss Anderson, she was very highly educated herself, and she was a teacher in the county for 47 years. This is one of her prized pictures where she was baptized in the Jordan River. She was a very religious woman. She went to Reed Street School when she was here, and after that she went on to college at Benedict and Atlanta University. As such a highly educated woman, she was a natural hire for one of the new schools that was founded on the north side of Anderson. At that time, it was going to be opened in a building that was owned by the Wilson Calvary Church, but later came to be known as the Northside Elementary School. Kind of an interesting detail that she includes in the book. Her 49 to 50 contract included this provision. As it is the policy of the board not to employ young married women as teachers, if you fall within said classification and should marry during the term of the contract, your employment will be automatically discontinued. And the reason for this being, that, of course, that there was no provision in place for maternity leave. So the solution was to just not hire the people who were most likely to become pregnant, which would be a young married individual. She actually kind of continued in the single life after that, even though she didn't have to. Her passion for teaching just continued, and that fed into the reasons why she completed this work on her book. And the second book, The Legacy of Black Pioneers, 1907 to 1980. And Gwendolyn Anderson was part of that project as well. There's a list here of people who are part of it, some who are sadly no longer with us. Al Norris, for one, has been a huge friend to this museum, a legacy of hard work towards preserving history. And Dr. B. Thompson, we're still lucky to have her as well. The first of the black business districts started to appear on South Main in the late 1800s. This map is a really cool one here, the Gray and Sons map. It's about 1890, I think. And it includes quite a lot of detail. By the early 1900s, the city began to put pressure on black business owners to relocate. And that's when Church Street sort of became the black business district. It was essentially using taxes and fees, condemnation of buildings, saying, this is no longer safe, you can't be here anymore. They would put in place these pressures. You can't be here, but here's the property on Church Street that we have available that you could purchase and build. So there were different strategies used, again, to maintain a sort of separation of the communities within Anderson, but Church Street became the place. Here's some pictures of those folks that put in so much effort. I wanted to kind of point out Willa Peak, too. We're going to talk about her husband that put together that Legacy of Black Pioneers book, and an immense amount of work that went into it. From here on out, we're going to kind of talk about some individuals, how their particular stories are connected. I sort of pulled these people out and tried to think about ways that their lives intersected with each other, and then what it means in the grander scheme of Anderson's history, what it meant for black history here, and trends that might have existed between national black history threads and what we had here locally. Dr. Norman Jenkins, apparently called Dr. N.A. by people who knew him well. He practiced medicine in Anderson from 1907 to 1919, and his brother Moses was also in the medical field. He was the first black pharmacist in Anderson. So together, they ran a practice, and the picture is South Main. This is sort of where City Hall would be on the left side, and his practice was originally located on the right side of the road, kind of where this picture was taken. They would become two of the first to sell their South Main property, purchase land on the north side of Church Street. The Church Street, of course, used to run the entire length between West Market School and First Baptist. And this would have been close to the First Baptist terminus of the road. And actually later on, in 1919, he would actually move down to Columbia, where he founded the Waverly Fraternity Hospital. Very recently was a historic marker that was dedicated there. Another hospital was begun in 1910 called Good Samaritan Hospital, and the two were competing constantly for nurses, doctors, supplies. So they decided to, instead of compete, merge, and it was the most successful black hospital, some would argue, in state history. Part of the hospital was also a nurses training school that Dr. Jenkins founded, so he was definitely using his talents to build up the black community, offer those chances for furthering education, further training for people. Sealy Davis, and that's who's in this picture. He was one of the first black Andersonians to own a car. And this was really a sign of success in that time. He was born into a farming family. He went to school in Mount Pleasant. There was a kind of a log, 1-room, 2-room possibly structure in the Mount Pleasant community near Williamston. And his first job was as a bellhop at the Chicola Hotel. He received his first pay for the week's work, and it was $1 for a week. And that was more money than he'd ever had in his hand at one time. But from there, he continued to work. He was promoted to the head bellboy, and he was earning $3 a week at that time. What really got behind him was his wife, Bertie Davis. She was the one who ended up pushing him to better himself, to continue learning, continue his education. And he ended up founding this grocery store on Church Street. The store, for a number of years, they had met at St. Paul's Baptist Church, which, by the way, St. Paul's comes up a lot. Mm-hmm. And as you know, any study of the civil rights movement, any study of an African American community, the churches become centers of action. They become places of networking, planning. They become places of community. And St. Paul's was definitely that here. They did eventually sell the grocery store in 1935, and they sold it to W.I. Peake. He opened the SD Cafe there, which was another super famous establishment on Church Street. He owned and operated also a funeral service, an ambulance service through the 40s and 50s. He's described in the book as being a hackman. Well, a hack is short for hackney, and hackney was a reference to a horse that was either too small or had been had aged past the point where it could be worked on like a farm. So you needed these big, strong, large horses to haul loads or work the farm. But when a horse aged past that or was too small, it was still suited for hauling little buggies, and it could be used to haul people around. So the hackman was the person who drove the hackney horse, but he was essentially a horse and buggy taxi service. And he got drafted into World War I, and when he came back, he looked around and he saw that time was heading towards the automobile. By the 1920s, Anderson was starting to have more and more people who owned them, and he could see that his business was not going to be the same if he didn't convert. So he was among the first people to make that change. He had built up a successful enough business to convert it to what we would now think of as a more traditional cab service. Willis Peake is the one who purchased, we just talked about Sealy Davis grocery store. He's the one who ended up purchasing it, but he's got a lot of his own story to tell, and I think he's probably, if I were to make a top 10 of overlooked historical actors in Anderson County's history, he would be on it. He also, again, owned the ST Cafe. The cafe became kind of this larger-than-life memory for a lot of people. They specialized in home cooking, became a staple in the community. The 1940s were a little bit tough for Mr. Peake. He never lost his passion for serving people, and he never lost his drive for success. So some of the ways that manifested itself was that he took it as kind of a personal charge to send some young people to college, and he was guiding them through the process and financially assisting them. And he also used his business as a headquarters to pack bags of fruit and deliver to people like around Christmas or the disadvantaged at different times of need. One of the cool things and innovative things that Peake was involved in was that he set up what was more or less a death and funeral insurance service. He was in partnership with Joe Day, and they called it the People's Burial Aid. And their aim was to just assist the black community with funeral costs. So people would pay in 25 cents per month that could then cover up to $150 of funeral costs, which at that time was pretty much it. And the profit that he was making off the insurance business was not going into his pocket. It was going back into serving the kids that he was sending off to Tuskegee. So he was using the money he made from this to fund that effort. This is a cool page from a county business directory that has Peak, Davis, and Jackson's funeral home. Thomas Brown Williams is one of those people that kind of brings it all together for me, and he's an example of why the Black Business District was such an important part of the broader African American community here. And his first job after graduating was with somebody we already discussed first, who was Dr. Jenkins, Dr. N.A. So Williams worked at the Jenkins drugstore with him and Moses up until he actually helped them move from Main Street to Church Street. He also worked for Jackson Funeral Home and the pool hall that Fred Jackson also owned, the pool hall in addition to the funeral home, which is another pretty famous memory that a lot of people had, was some of the recreation, I guess, that would happen at Church Street. By the 1930s, he helped establish the football team at Reed Street, the Blue Devils. He also helped gather up and collect the first set of equipment that they had that they could use. The team eventually would move to West Side, but he stayed at Perry Elementary. But one of his crowning achievements was establishing this marching troop. There's boys from the school, boys from the community, and they were called Brown Williams Marching Platoon, and they'd be seen in local parades. Additionally, he worked to establish parks in Black communities around downtown to give everyone equal access to public recreational areas. And this was done during a time that he worked for Anderson City Recreation Program. He helped establish this team, and that's him on the far left in the hat. He also would end up getting the Citizen of the Year award around 1970, kind of recognizing his connection with the community, Hartford community. Thomas Brown Williams, the reason I kind of like his story as a connector is that the earliest leaders of the Black Business District were putting down that first layer of foundation, if you can think of it that way. They did the hardest work to establish their own businesses, carve out what success they could, and a lot of them were very successful. But then people like Brown Williams came on in this second generation and built further. He was doing all this for school-age children, athletic programs, the parks, creating further and further opportunities, and all this snowballs in this way that created such a strong identity for what it means to be a Black Andersonian. When Church Street was going to finally be paved over into this parking lot, that was a spur for a lot of people to say that all these stories, all these people who remember, we need to start capturing it now. Because, the paving over is kind of a really good metaphor, because, it's really tough to know what was there now. But it did result in the Heritage Park there. One of the cool things that they decided to do was to include this time capsule, which would be opened in 32. And I'm really excited to be around when that happened.